if other people come in, that would be just fine. So thank you all so much for being here. We are so excited to share some of our research and the work we've been doing. I am Martell Stevens. I am the program director at Boston University BU Wheelock, and before that I was a former high school social studies teacher and department chair at Framingham High School, where I had the pleasure of co-teaching with Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Martell. I'm an assistant professor of social studies education at UMass Boston and a former faculty member at BU Wheelock, and also a former teacher at Framingham High School, where I taught with Kaylee.
So tonight we are going to spend some time talking about Teaching History for Justice, which is a book that Chris and I wrote based on 10 years of research of following around race-conscious teachers and gender equitable teachers and observing them and interviewing them and collecting their classroom materials. We will make the presentation available to you all, so you can just email Chris or I if you'd like a copy. Also, this presentation is being recorded, so it will be played on YouTube, and Mary Ellen will send out the information to watch this. So there's no need to take notes, and you can fast forward and work through if you want to see anything again. We will be using the chat to take any questions you have tonight, and we hope to have a little bit of discussion. So we encourage you to put all your questions, responses in the chat. There'll also be a moment to use the Jamboard in a little bit when we ask you some questions. And we will have a lot of time at the end for questions. Chris and I will talk for 20 or so minutes, and then hopefully the rest of the time can be a discussion to talk about teaching practices or thoughts behind teaching history for justice. So without any further ado, I will start. I'm going to share my screen, which I'm sure you're all used to hearing a lot lately. So Chris and I are presenting tonight about teaching history for justice, and this is really a framework about building classrooms around activist thinking. What we really hope to do is create a space where students can begin to think about how to be activists of change through a K through 12 level. So we wanted to start by asking you all a question. I think Chris is putting this in the chat, the link to the Jamboard, but if you're a current history teacher, which I've noticed a few of you are based on the panelists, think about the units that you teach now, and then reflecting back on your own history experience in your social studies classrooms. What units of study do you remember? What do you remember learning about? And maybe what do you teach about? So I'm going to stop my share for a minute and give you a few minutes to respond in the Jamboard.
Yeah, we'd really like you to list particularly like what are some of the units you remember experiencing, like how did your history class organize itself, or how do you as a teacher organize your classroom? You'll notice there's a little sticky note icon. Just click that and it should allow you to start typing on the Jamboard. We'll start reading off some of the ideas that folks write on the Jamboard.
Perfect.
See, one person wrote, as a student, I remember the American Revolution, the Civil War, and World War I and II. So lots of military history, perhaps. World War I and World War II. I remember learning about significant Supreme Court cases in AP government with Dr. Martell. Some former students. As a student, it was a lot of American history, the American Revolution and the colonial period.
And Rebecca Smith put in the chat that in high school, I remember studying important Supreme Court lawsuits and decisions. That was fascinating for me.
Someone else wrote on the Jamboard, as a student in elementary school, I remember studying holidays and food. In high school, I just remember learning timelines. As a student, I remember presidents, slavery, Civil War. As a student, American history and something about Mesopotamia. Maybe I'll let a few more folks. If you can't access the Jamboard, feel free to put it in the chat as well. All right. I think everyone is. Oh, one more. Rarely got to the modern day. As a student, I spent a long time learning about the founding fathers in 8th grade. In high school, I memorized and promptly forgot a lot of dates.
Well, this is really important and is a great starting off point for our talk tonight, to think a little bit about how this impacts us and how units of study are thought of in the social studies class and planned.
All right, so many of the units that you described would probably resonate with most students in an American social studies or history classroom. And so, for example, you'll routinely see a unit on Caesar in ancient Rome if you're in an ancient world class in middle school, or the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. In US history classrooms, we often organize our units around presidents. And even when the unit's called something like the Great Depression or World War I, we're in many ways really organizing around Woodrow Wilson, or what was the other example I gave? Oh, Depression, FDR, right? Slide. And in fact, this is how the state of Massachusetts organizes its curriculum framework. Pretty much almost any social studies textbook or history textbook that you'll find in a classroom organizes around these same units. And in many ways, whether it's presidents or other powerful individuals, they're often organizing history around one usually powerful individual. Slide. Kayleen and I in the book argue that this is really a historical and fundamental flaw to how we organize social studies classrooms, and specifically history classrooms, which our book focuses on, because it sends an impression to students that change is usually one powerful individual. But if we've learned anything from recent racial justice movements, including a lot of kind of the Black Lives Matter activism, or the anti-Asian American hate activism over the last year, that it's only when the people demanding change force any sort of leader or powerful individual or even government to make change, that's when it occurs. Slide. And so in our book, one of the first things Kaylee and I did is we did a little bit of historical research, and we said, where did these units come from? Where did they originate? And you can actually go back and look at history textbooks from the 19th century, over 100 years ago, and they organized their units around these same structures. For instance, these are two textbooks from the late 1800s. The first one showing you the chapter on how Columbus discovered America, which in many ways is how we still and problematically frame the arrival of settler colonizers from Europe to the Americas. Or another chapter from a different history book was on how the chapter is actually called Abraham Lincoln, one of the greatest men. So this idea that still today in many elementary, middle school, or high school classrooms, you may see Lincoln presented the same way. I will also note there's a lot of pushback in the early 20th century by especially Southern politicians to not teach Lincoln as a great man, and that's a whole other level of complexity. But either way, these complex kind of narratives are presenting a very specific perspective. Slide. And we make an argument in the book that these perspectives are actually rooted in white supremacy. These textbooks that we still use the same organizers to present history today, certainly adding more recent historical events to them, but this kind of powerful individual was really an idea proposed and maintained by white supremacists in the 19th century. So Herbert Spencer, who is an English sociologist and psychologist, and is described by many historians as the developer of scientific racism or social Darwinism, advocated for the teaching of Western civilization and this kind of great man theory to provide students with proof of European superiority. Around the same time in the United States, there's this group called the Committee of Seven, which was 6 white men and 1 white woman, released a report in the late 1890s that argued that history classrooms should be framed around great European and American civilization and their achievements. And here they meant really white Americans. Slide. So using the chat box, we'd like you to just kind of say, what do you think organizing history around powerful individuals and perhaps some of these white supremacist ideas has led to students thinking about the past? So feel free to throw in the chat, you know, what do you think the outcome of this has been for generations of students learning history this way?
I'm going to unshare so you have time to process your thoughts, and I'm going to just put the question in the chat so you have it. Oh, Lindsay Combs, I'm so happy to see your name. I hope you're doing well, and if you're in Hawaii or wherever you are. Perfect response here, right? Thinking that other people will make the change, not me, right? This lack of empowerment towards our students. A limited perspective or only one viewpoint, right? A very narrow lens for looking at history. Students often ignore the large movements of people, right, and focus on these one individuals as heroes. It teaches only contributions of a select few. And thank you, Taylor Collins, right, for it's more what the hidden curriculum is telling us, right? When we leave out certain voices, that sends messages too, right? Making no place in history, as Taylor wrote, for a person of color. It erases everyone, thank you, Lauren, for anyone who's not a white male, and it promotes individualism over collective action, which is something we want our students to be able to do, work together to make change. It focuses on authority with leaders, right? Showing leaders as this top-down, right? Not a collective group, right? Again, Jamie wrote, it devalues collective actions, and it reinforces white-centric history, ignores collective efforts of community, and it probably results in focusing on just a bunch of white men. So the messages it sends of disempowering students, and also the who is represented, great. That you have to be something, oh, I love this comment by Linda, you have to be something extraordinary or special to make some kind of difference, right? And so we argue, and thank you, because those responses in the chat were great. Yeah, we argue that this kind of curriculum leads to citizens thinking one person, and often a male or a white male, makes a change, right? Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, Martin Luther King integrated, Woodrow Wilson gave women the right to vote. All of these things, when Chris and I were doing our research, we saw in textbooks and curriculum materials. And this is so disempowering to our students. Not only in what you all said in the chat was spot on, not only in who is represented, but this idea that, oh, well, I guess I don't have the power to make change, right? It's just this one elite person. And also, as we think about, and I know one of the comments in the Jamboard was when that person learned history, they did not see anything modern, right? But it also looks at today's politicians, that one person has to make the change. And again, students then don't feel empowered to be agents of change, to be activists. And if we think of this top-down approach to history, that it's presidents or really these white male leaders that are making the change, it neglects to look at people who have organized movements. In fact, majority of Americans do not believe that past or present movements made the United States better. And if you think about all the movements, the labor movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, LGBTQ rights, Occupy Wall Street, presently Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, majority of Americans don't feel these movements are something that has made our country better. And that has to do with how they're taught, or if they're taught, or what way they're taught in schools. The only movement that has been positively viewed by Americans is the civil rights movement, and hence the civil rights movement is probably the widest movement taught, the African American civil rights movement taught in schools. And as we continue teaching this traditional approach where one leader makes a change and it's top down, it leads to groups of power thinking everything's just fine, because you're not taking time to show how structures oppress the majority of people. And people in power really do think everything's just fine. 37% of white Americans, only 30% of white Americans, so the majority of our country thinks that we don't really need to go any further in providing equal rights for people of color. Only 42% of American men feel that there needs to be more progress in gender equality, right? So the majority of men think everything's fine when it comes to gender equity and equality. And then only 37% of middle and upper class Americans believe that their advantages in life are due to a main factor is their personal wealth. So it's the rich not seeing classism, men not seeing sexism, white people not seeing racism, because the people in power have learned their own history and that their leaders have helped create this, instead of learning about activism and movements. So we believe we actually need to radically reteach and rethink how we teach history in K through 12 schools. We want to focus on teaching for seeking justice and learning about fairness, and having this be the foundational element of teaching.
And so in this, in many ways, thinking about, especially like white folks, when you hear them say things like, well, my ancestors were able to be successful, so everyone should be. We think that the history they're learning is really continually sending them that message, and they're not understanding all the other complicated and complex stories of other groups of people. And so, we argue in the book that there's a missing paradigm in social studies and history education, and that is activist thinking. So if you can go back for 1 second. Essentially, there's been a lot of research, especially 30, 40 years ago from the cognitive psychology folks that say, we should think like historians, we should have students and citizens learn how historians do their work and kind of model that in our classroom, and that's excellent work. But it only gets us so far. And then in the early 2000s, late 90s, another group of kind of researchers and scholars said, no, we have to learn how to use history as a tool for democratic thinking and democratic, citizenship. And we're hoping to add to this and that's also very important, but we're hoping to add to this conversation by saying there's a third kind of important emphasis that we need in our history classrooms, and that is, how do activists do their work? How are movements for change kind of formed? How are they successful, or how do they fail? And how can we use that to look at past movements and activists in history? Slide. And around that, we also argue for 3 pedagogical shifts that really need to happen in social studies or history classrooms. The first one, there's been a push, really since the 90s to really since John Dewey, or even the 1960s, really, to center our social studies classrooms on inquiry and our history classrooms on inquiry. But who are we inquiring about? And so for us, if we want to make our inquiries social, they have to have debatable questions that not only ask, how did the important people in power make the decisions that they made, but instead focus those questions on power relationships. And fairness and justice, and how was that achieved? It also has to center counter narratives from non-dominant groups. And it's not just enough to have one source from a group that maybe wasn't in power, but also present those groups as not monoliths, but not essentialize their experience, but instead show that the communities themselves have these internal debates about the events that they're experiencing. Slide. Additionally, we argue for a multiculturalism that's critical. There's been an advocacy for multicultural education for decades now. And we really use the work of Christine Sleeter and others here in arguing that we need to really focus on multicultural work around equity. And so traditionally, multiculturalism has been positioned around kind of liberal views, an overemphasis on tolerance, which we certainly think tolerating others is something that's important. But as Sonia Nieto would say, it's the lowest level of support for oppressed people or for non-dominant groups. And so instead of learning to live together, the focus really needs to be on how do we undo systems of power and privilege that give more power to one group over others and maintain unfairness. Slide. And then the last part really comes from the work of James Banks and others around, citizenship and how typically many democracies exclude certain people from the democratic project. And here the idea is that students must learn how to use the levers of democracy to make society better. And that includes taking action. A lot of people James Banks does a wonderful job of explaining how some citizens are passive citizens, other citizens are excluded citizens, and we need to work together to make sure that all citizens are incorporated in the democracy, have equal and equitable voice, really. And with this, Kaylee and I have argued that this should not be a partisan act, but it is a political act, that everyone needs to understand ideologies and the underpinning ideas of why certain citizens might prefer certain policy decisions, but this is not a partisan endeavor. And we've seen a concerning, you might have seen the current events recently, obviously with the 1776 commission in the last days of the Trump presidency. We've seen states try to remove the teaching of slavery, enslavement, and segregation from their curricula. And they're using the curriculum for a partisan tool that wants to stifle debate and discussion. And we would argue instead that all people from all ideological backgrounds should be working towards justice using their ideological frames. Slide.
So what we want to do, and one of the things I do love about the book, is the first couple chapters really presenting this framework, which Chris just did really well. And then the last part of the book is vignettes about different teachers. And I know some of our teachers who helped us write this are in the audience, so thank you for attending, about how this work can be done. So we're doing a mini example of how we can start thinking about this work. So in the chat box, we're going to ask you if you can name some activists for justice. And that can be at any time in history. So I'm going to stop my share and I'll let you share in the chat.
Any activists for justice that you've learned about in the past? You got Fred Hampton. Nice to see you, Mike. He's someone who, until this year, almost no one would mention, but thank goodness for, there's a good side and a bad side of historical films, but I appreciate that now people know the name Fred Hampton. A lot of people knew the name Fred Hampton, but not the majority. Other activists for justice. Stacey Abrams, Angela Davis, Gloria Steinem, Harvey Milk, Ella Baker, Cesar Chavez, John Lewis, Rachel Cargill, Angela Davis, W.B. Du Bois, Deloria, Maya Angelou, Bree Newsome, James Baldwin, Elijah Aluo, Angela Davis, A. Philip Randolph.
I think we have a pretty impressive audience. I like that.
Yeah, often Bettina Love, Shirley Chisholm. Often we do this with groups. It's not this range of activists. We usually get Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, maybe Cesar Chavez. All right, shall we move?
Yes. So
Ibram Kendi.
oh yes, a BU affiliate. So
And
some of you did name. I think we did have.
Yes, we got Shirley Chisholm and Angela Davis here.
Angela Davis.
And
I don't know if we got Harriet Tubman or not, but we want to go through, and Chris is going to go through some of these amazing women activists who really embody intersectionality. And as women and women of color, they don't always have the luxury of just fighting for one cause. And these women are often left out of history books, although you all did a really great job diversifying your activists. But I think these are some people that we can do a better job teaching about in history classroom. And I'll let Chris go through them for you.
One of our goals, we hope you leave today, at least knowing a few more activists that you can teach in your classrooms or tell your fellow citizens about. And we use citizen, we mean very broadly, any member of a community who works for democracy and justice. And we want to also start by saying, although we're featuring individual activists, none of these activists would say they did this alone. And in fact, they were only parts of larger movements. So Angela Davis, of course, is an activist for racial and gender equity and democracy. She's a prison abolitionist. She was a member of the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles, the Communist Party USA, and possibly one of the most preeminent radical scholars of the last 40, 50 years. Slide. This is Yuri Kochiyama. Her and her family were actually incarcerated during the Second World War because they were Japanese Americans. She's an activist for Black and Asian American liberation. She was a member of the anti-war movement and worked very closely with Malcolm X around issues of Black and Asian American liberation. Slide. This is Harriet Tubman. Many, of course, know her, but sometimes they don't know how complex and deep her story is. She was an abolitionist and women's rights leader. She rescued over 70 people from slavery. And you know, on top of it, she was a spy and helped as a nurse during the Civil War, and just was an activist in many other aspects. And of course, although the previous administration prevented her from appearing on the $20 bill, it looks like that is going to move forward. Yes, slide. This is Doris Huerta. She often is missing in the story of the migrant farm workers movement in California, but she was a co-leader of the United Farm Workers with Cesar Chavez, and they had equally important roles. Oftentimes the media paid more attention to Cesar than Dolores. She was an activist for Latinx and women's liberation movements. Much of her work was around women farm workers and the different issues that they faced in the fields of California. Slide. This is Buffalo Calf Road woman. She was a Cheyenne military leader, and in fact, she's been erased from history books as the U.S. government did not accept women as military leaders in the 19th century. And even today, there are many ceilings preventing women from becoming in the top leadership of our military. She was a part of the indigenous freedom struggle. She was a military leader at the indigenous resistance of the Battle of Little Bighorn. Slide. This is, of course, Shirley Chisholm. Someone mentioned her in the chat. Civil rights leader, women's rights leader, voting rights activist, educational activist, former teacher, first African-American woman in Congress, first woman and African-American to seek the presidential nomination. Slide. This is Lenata Warjack. She was a leader of the American Indian movement. She was one of the organizers of the occupation of Alcatraz in San Francisco. She was also a member of the Third World Strike in the Bay Area and nationally, trying to unite different groups, Asian Americans, Indigenous Americans, and Latinos into a collective struggle for liberation. Today, she actually works for Native tribal sovereignty and is a scholar of Native law and governance. Slide. This is Martha P. Johnson. She was an activist for queer and trans rights and part of the AIDS awareness movement, a prominent figure during the Stonewall Uprising of 1969. She was a founding member of the Gay Liberation Front and the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionary, and is known for much of her work with her close friend Sylvia Rivera. Slide. So we hope to kind of leave you with some ideas as teachers, as community members, as citizens. How do we change this? How do we change what we're studying? How do we change what we're teaching? And so the first question we really want you to constantly think about is, whose sources do we read? There's a huge push for source work in social studies and in history, but whose sources are we centering? And what types of sources are we centering? In fact, European and white Americans typically document their histories through written texts. So if you're relying heavily on written texts, you might be missing many other communities' sources that may be in artifact, that might be in images, that might be in oral stories, and that might have been systematically erased from the record. Slide.
So
we
started today talking a little bit about what you learned in K through schooling in your history classes, and those women that Chris described, I learned nothing about any of them, right? I instead learned that Woodrow Wilson gave women the right to vote and Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. So we want you to start thinking about your own classrooms and your own learning experience, whether you're a K through 12 teacher or whether you're an education professor, and think about how to sort of revolutionize what we are teaching, how we are teaching it. And our book, we feel, does help do that. Well, it's already released, but basically, as I said before, the idea is that we can restructure the classroom to teach history for justice and really look at activism as part of the framework, to study students, to center activism and student study of the past. And the book lays out, like, really nicely a framework for what has been done in the history classroom up to this point, and then follows the life of teachers. And I know Jen Bryson is here, Taylor Collins, and it was really important us to use people who are actually in the classroom doing this work as co-authors of the book, because we really wanted to recognize that work. And from start to finish, from day one to what's hanging on the walls, to how you end your classroom, to classroom norms, to assessments, to units of study, to activist projects your students can create, it's all in there. So hopefully that will sort of serve as a toolbox or a guide to start doing this work, because I've talked to so many educators, teachers, student teachers, pre-service teachers that say, I do want to do this work. I do want the social studies history classroom to be a mechanism to reduce classism, racism, sexism, ableism, and other isms. And I just need a starting point. So we're hoping that this book serves as a starting point. And our emails are here. If you have any questions or you want a copy of the slide and a link to the book. And we really want to use the rest of the time. We have about a little over 20 minutes. We wanted to structure it so that we can answer questions, and this can be more of an open discussion. So we're not just talking at you. Obviously, we stand for teaching that is social inquiry. So we want to make sure to model that to a certain extent. So feel free to put your questions in the chat and we can address them. And also we can ask you all some questions too, like we did earlier as well.
I really wish we were in person. It'd be so nice to be in a room where we could all be and ask these questions, but we'll have to do it in this format. So Alice asks, given the enduring nature and current escalation of anti-Semitism in the United States and globally, are there any efforts in the book to identify individuals who are actively fighting Holocaust revisionism and other forms of anti-Semitism? And that's a great question, and we don't have any large section of the book dedicated to it. We talk about justice more broadly, but we do certainly have some references in the book about recent violence towards Jewish Americans and towards synagogues. We also talk about centering kind of different religious traditions in the teaching of the past. Oftentimes a very kind of Christian-centric narrative is taught in the United States. And using kind of the frameworks we put forward, any teacher would be, and I will say, not just obviously anti-Semitic, but other forms of kind of religious discrimination or oppression. So we also talk about it, violence and discrimination towards Muslim Americans, towards Sikh Americans, and other groups who aren't Christian, and how it's important to kind of make sure we center and teach their experiences.
Thanks, Chris. I think he answered it great. And I think part of this is not centering the narrative, we said of white male people in power, wealthy, but also the Christian narrative, like moving away from that. I think, I don't know if there's an example in the book or one we saw when we were doing observations, but, so often when you study holidays in school, you refer to like Christmas break and you have just a Christian center, which again, that's exactly what we want to move away from in the book. We want to take a critical look about who's been highlighted in history and who's been studied.
And I think too, in the world history chapter, we mentioned obviously teaching the Holocaust there, and obviously Holocaust denial is a major problem we need to teach against. But we also talk about a longer kind of Jewish and other religious groups' stories that really begin in our ancient history chapter. The problem is often Jewish Americans only see themselves in the curriculum when it's the Holocaust, and they've been a part of the American story and obviously the world story for much longer than that. And we also don't want to teach the victimization of groups, but also that groups had agency and resistance and are sustaining their kind of religion or other kind of cultural aspects.
Lauren Funk had a question. What advice would you give to teachers who may want to engage in anti-racist and critical pedagogy, but are in contexts where it is discouraged or even prohibited? We get this question a lot, huh, Chris?
Yeah, this is our West Virginia chapter. And really the last chapter in the book, which is all about overcoming barriers. So Nima Avezia, who's an excellent teacher in the Boston Public Schools, and much of her teaching was around ancient history, co-wrote the ancient history chapter with us. And she is an Indian American who grew up in West Virginia. And so we wanted her insights as to how would a teacher in that part of the country, and maybe we center it in a city in West Virginia, but a city that's obviously rural in many ways. And how do you address parent or community pushback, and how do you do this work? And we have a whole chapter on it. So without kind of explaining the chapter, the basic idea is that you need to know how to do this work in the communities you're working. And that really goes for any context that you're in. You need to know where the community's at and ways to kind of push and challenge. And at the same time, ways to get buy-in and support from your colleagues, from your administration, and frankly, from parents and community members, so that they see that your attempt here is that we're all working towards justice, and there's not necessarily just one way to reach justice. I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And allies, Chris mentioned this already, but allies are so important in this work. And it has been reassuring in the last decade of studying this that there are a lot more people who at least on the surface appear to care about this. So find those people in the communities. It might not be your administration, it might be fellow teachers, there may be department chairs there might be someone in a different department, there might be someone in a different school, there might be some community leaders, but you should form a cohort of people that you can bounce ideas off and share, because doing this, anti-racist teaching, there is sometimes pushback, as Lauren mentioned, and there are sometimes a fear that as teachers we're trying to indoctrinate our students or force them into voting a certain way. And I think that goes back to Chris's point earlier, that it's not partisan, it is political. And I always say that people who are very, very nervous to do this work, start local, like start in your own community. I think making initiatives and doing activist work to better your community, whether it is to keep your Salvation Army open, or whether it's to think about how rent affects the people that live in your community, or thinking even about like recycling efforts, small things, maybe even within the school that you can do. And really, in one of our chapters, one of the assessments is really to encourage students to think about movements they really care about, like what is meaningful for them. Are they really touched by the Me Too movement, climate change? Like what is going to spark that engagement and enthusiasm in your students and encourage them to follow through in those efforts so they can practice being activists at a very young age?
And I would add at the end of all this, like in some ways, being a teacher, if you're doing this work, means also being an activist. So there's an important role for teachers in some ways to resist things. Like we were just talking about states that are trying to ban the teaching of slavery or segregation or colonization, and trying to frame particularly like you need to teach a topic this way. This is like a real struggle that history and social studies teachers are facing. And sometimes it means standing up and resisting that, and doing the act of I'm going to teach my students about these justice movements because they need to know this. And obviously with any activism sometimes comes consequences, but pushing back on that to ensure that your students are learning all the narratives of history is important.
Connor asked about unpacking to embrace the practice of teaching for justice within the current state standards.
Yeah, I mean,
we like to say our standards are a guide, not a prescription.
Luckily, although more and more partisan attempts to say, you need to teach Barry Goldwater in a particular way is starting to occur. In most states, it's still a list of content that is to be taught. Perhaps some states like Massachusetts might offer questions to be examined. So it leaves a lot of liberty as to how you address that. So if it says, teach World War II, it doesn't, in that you're teaching the standards if you're teaching activists during World War II, including people that stood up and thought the war was wrong or advocated, the United States obviously denied the entrance of people fleeing, death camps and concentration camps in Europe, or activists here in the United States that stood up for Japanese Americans who were being incarcerated, including Japanese Americans themselves. And so I would really in the book, we argue this can be done in this highly standards-based context by showing that you're meeting those standards, but you're having the students really unpack them in a different way.
Another question about the state, how do we get the state of Massachusetts to mandate anti-racist equity pre-K college with teacher education required and providing something like an SEI mandate?
Well, I would say, yeah, well, right now there's a bill in the State House that would, it has language around anti-oppression and ethnic studies and a few other aspects that currently are not really present in our curriculum. And so if you email me, I can get you information about the sponsors of that bill. But it really, like anything, we need activists and a movement to push certainly the legislature to act on that. But beyond that, I've seen a lot of mandates from DESE and other places, and having a mandate doesn't necessarily mean it happens. And I also worry a bit about a mandate to teach like anti-oppressive or anti-racist curriculum in the hands of people who have not done the self-work of it and are not constantly questioning and reflecting. Could be a recipe for disaster. So I would say it's a double-edged sword in some ways of like a mandate could be good, but without support, without we could be heading down a troubling road as well. So.
And I appreciate you mentioned social-emotional learning and the mandates that are coming out or the bills that are coming out to support that. And that seems to be everywhere right now. And Eleonora, our colleague who's here, she has been working on this for years, and it was radical, right? To teach social-emotional skills and teach the whole child, right? You're supposed to teach content. You're not supposed to teach those things in school. And I think at this point, people might think, wow, it is radical to teach about oppression in some areas, right? Racism, sexism, classism. It's radical to teach students to be activists and to question and challenge authority. And then we'll look back in 10 years and there'll be a law to do this, right? So I think one of the things is we need to start doing this work and seeing the benefits, just like people started doing social-emotional teaching before it was seen in state law.
And I guess finally, with just the SEI kind of analogy, I mean, that was really a reaction to parents with civil rights lawsuits saying that the way that a lack of bilingual education, and addressing kind of the needs of emerging bilingual students, kind of forced that, right? So that's another form of activism. That was, and obviously there's been bills since then, like I think the Look bill, that have found some problems with that mandate, and have kind of found other supports that were needed. So
we have another question in the chat, and I'm so glad that we have this question about ideas on how to move your students from learning about activism to actually becoming change makers themselves. I'm looking to have my students move to taking action in my class. And that is a key piece in this book. So Chris spoke of this third pillar to teaching for justice, which is transformative democratic citizenship. And that is the place where students actually do the work. So in the book, you'll read chapters about a Black Lives Matter protest organized by students and facilitated by the teacher and negotiated with the administration. You will actually see this piece. And this is something I've been doing for a long time in my class. I mean, even, thinking about things in terms of sexism, we had students want to talk about body image with women. So we had a student who had an eating disorder. She came forward, she shared that. And so we raised money for NEDA, the National Eating Disorder Association, and we made a life-size Barbie, a paper mache Barbie, and they're so thin, the proportions. But the students were actually passionate about this cause. They made PSA announcements that ran in our local news station. They had this Barbie that people stopped and looked at in the hall. But it's such an important piece, is this transformative democratic citizenship. That is the piece that moves them from just the learner to the actual activist.
Yeah, one of the other examples we have in the book, from the West Virginia chapter, is and this was from Nima's idea. The students learn about the indigenous people of West Virginia, and they realize that they've been erased from their community, and like their history is not present. So there's actually a bunch of mounds that were built by the native people of West Virginia. And so the students went and did QR codes and placed up signs at these historic sites that are walked by every day that people don't know about. So that's also that idea of like using history as an activist tool to teach more history that's often erased, right?
Lindsay has a great question about, and this is a question, an age-old question about whether or not you should center your classroom from a thematic model or more of a chronological model, and what maybe brings more of an activist lens.
Yeah, I mean, my take is like both can, and I don't think one or the other particularly matters. I mean, obviously with chronology, movements have a chronology to them because, and in the book we talk about kind of how they begin with a group kind of saying, this is how society is, and then reimagining what it could be. And then next is they start to organize to convince fellow community members that change needs to happen, whether it's on the national level or the local level or the global level. And then there's often a trigger event that gets them the attention they need. And from there, movements often succeed or fail because they're not able to sustain the change beyond the trigger event. And so there is a chronology to it. But that same chronology can be taught within thematic units, right? Like thematic units aren't chronology like neutral, right? So like that's another way to organize it would be around these kind of justice ideas about, you could organize around how people work for justice and gender and race and organize it that way. So I don't know if there's one way that's better than the other, but it can be done both ways. I don't know, Kayleen, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And I think we're talking about rethinking and revolutionizing the way you teach history. So if you're struggling, as you said in the chat, to do this chronologically, why not teach it thematically, right? It's about students making those connections from the past to the present and seeing, when you're doing a critical multicultural lens, which is one of our pillars, right? Seeing this oppression throughout and then how they can be agents of change. Part of what we discuss in the book in this critical multicultural view is that you actually reimagine a society that's different, right? So how can we imagine a society that there is not such deep racism and police brutality, right, in our structures? How do we make those changes? What can be done? And so maybe that makes sense for you to organize your classroom thematically to make that happen, or maybe you can figure out chronologically at the end of every unit or throughout each unit I teach, what am I infusing about activism? What movements am I talking about? And I think in the book, we have examples of both teachers who do it both ways successfully. So.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah. Yes, and.
Right. Taylor Collins, who's on this call, really has envisioned perhaps teaching U.S. history through the different lenses of ethnic groups in the United States. So you start with an indigenous history, and then you go back and do it again through a Black lens. Then you go through and do it again through like a Latinx lens, and then you do it through an Asian American lens, and so like there's then maybe you do through a gender lens. So there's a lot of really cool ways to approach it. Scott Solberg, nice to see you, Scott. Wrote in the chat, would love more historical figures in addition to those mentioned, who've advocated for decent work that I can include in my Voc Psych class. Look forward to applying some of the social justice action strategies in my courses. And yeah, I mean, one of the things we try to do in the book is really include a lot of those, just like we did at the end of our presentation, those people, those movements you don't even know about, right? So Kaylee and I kind of played a game of like, let's try and trick each other, like not trick each other, but like challenge each other to like add a movement we didn't know about as a teacher. That like we need to really like look at the content and say like, what movements are we missing? And of course, there's many movements and activists we don't include in the book, but we hope as you're reading, you are also learning history, as well as learning how to teach history, as well as how to learn how to teach about activists and movements.
We have a question about developmentally appropriate ways in which children can develop personal agency and perhaps ideas for family involvement. I think Jen Bryson, who was on the call, she helped us write our chapter. We wanted it to be K through 12 schooling, and there's a lot of good resources in this chapter. And actually, Chris and I both teach elementary school teachers to do this. I don't know, Chris, if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, so I mean, we co-wrote with Jen Bryson the elementary chapter, and it's really thinking about, and sadly, we don't have an early childhood chapter, but this work needs to really start in early childhood settings and then continue really through graduate school and beyond, right? So we do talk about what this looks like at the different levels. We have a chapter in elementary, a chapter on middle school, 2 chapters on high school, and how keeping the kind of developmental level of the students at that point is important, and how this work, especially at the elementary level, there's a lot of research that elementary teachers sometimes find teaching about racism or sexism or classism or other forms of oppression is taboo or controversial, and they can't teach it. But we offer some strategies on focusing on fairness, on thinking about differences, on thinking about who's included and who's not, and really start with this in kindergarten and continue it all the way through beyond high school.
One resource that I would recommend, which the EDI committee brought in Kai Gross, who they do woke kindergarten. You just Google woke kindergarten and you'll find it, and it does a lot of
cringe at the word woke sometimes, the way it's
they did too. They did that. But there's a lot of really cool developmentally appropriate resources doing this kind of work, and don't be afraid to do this at a really young age and involve parents in how they can talk to their students and to their children. I mean, Chris and I are both parents, right? And I know firsthand that students are aware of race and gender differences, and they start to be aware of class differences at a very young age. So by not talking about it, I think Taylor Collins mentioned earlier, you're sending a hidden curriculum, right? By being quiet about these issues. And I think families too, I've talked to parents who are hungry, but how do I talk to my students about this? And sharing that what you're doing in your class and what some of your goals are, and that you have this activist approach to teaching, and inviting parents to be part of that conversation is really important.
Should probably give a little plug to my colleagues, my early childhood colleagues here at UMass Boston. They're actually doing a film night, which is a virtual film night that's open to the public in a few weeks. And it's going to be about doing anti-racist, anti-oppression work with with young children. So if you want info on how to get on the list and watch it with them, please email me and I can send you the registration info. So we could do a little UMass Boston BU cross-pollination here. I'm not going to address Taylor Collins' question.
Did we get all the questions, Chris? Oh, wait.
Oh, this is a good one. I guess we'll end with this last one because we have 2 minutes left. So Lindsay asks, I'm thinking a lot about teaching materials like textbooks and online resources. They don't take an activist lens on their history materials. Any tips? Now, Kayleen, and my dream is that our next book that we're going to pitch to TC Press and see if they like it would be more of a kind of a lesson plan oriented book that kind of gives some example lesson plans. And there are a few out there. I would encourage you to look up Prentice Chandler's book on doing race and social studies. It's a book of lesson plans that do this work. And really, I think you need to be good curators of materials for your students, right? Like, I love the Stanford History Educators Group. They've done a lot of great things to get a lot of materials into the hands of teachers to teach inquiry, but not all their materials are focused on justice or activism or movements. And so you can adapt those materials to say like, well, what's the justice angle here? Or what's the activist angle here? And add some additional voices. What groups are missing? What groups are being presented monolithically? And how can I add more sources? So, and I would say textbooks might be futile. Like, I mean, these typically, we know Texas like has a lot of oversight on what's included in their textbooks. There's a great New York Times story, which was really saying what researchers of history textbooks have known for decades, that believe it or not, kids read different textbooks in different states. California and Texas and other states actually have different pages that present history in different ways. So I would say if you're kind of forced to use a textbook, have the students antagonize that textbook in the same way they would any source. Look, who's the perspective? Look in the front pages. Who's the authors of the textbook? And frankly, those folks don't even get to have total control over what the book has in it, right? So, Kayleen, anything you want to add in our last?
And I know we're at time, so I don't want to keep you all. And I do want to say words of gratitude because I know this is dinner hour, and I know our colleagues at BU, this is the last week of the semester, and for our teachers, a lot of them are like going back from hybrid to full time to remote and managing all this. So thank you so much for your time. And I will just say to Lindsay's question, so much about this work is hard because it's about educating ourselves and unlearning ourselves. I know the team of teachers, including Taylor, who worked on rewriting our US 1 curriculum. I mean, they spent their entire summer and fall just reading books, working with our librarian to I want to teach also about ableism and mental health as the stigmas around that. What are some books I should read on that? And that's such a piece of it, right? And that's why we need a community of all of you who are here to keep doing this work, because we have to keep reading and learning and unlearning and sharing and figuring out how to do this work.
Thank you, everyone. This has been great. And please see me in person at some point.
Yes, thank you so much. It was so good to see all of you.
Oh, Eleonora, and I wish I could see you. How's it going? Thank you.
I'm going to put my email in the chat, even though it was on the slideshow, just in case you want to share any further questions. And I think Chris is probably doing that.
Yeah, I'm doing that as well right now. So please reach out.
Thank you all so much.
Oh, Don, I miss you, Don. Nice to see you here.